We're glad you are with us here for Inside the Courtroom. So, Erica, our final day, Lori Vallow Daybell's final chance to, if she were going to, right, make any sort of defense or represent herself, on the stand, actually take the stand, offer her own evidence. Today was the day for her to decide that.
Yeah, and she does not do it. We started court this morning, day 9, in Lori Vallow Daybell's murder conspiracy trial in Arizona. She's accused of conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow, with her brother, Alex Cox. So certainly a lot of circumstances, and we've had a lot to unpack with the prosecution so far. But no, she affirmed today in front of the jury that she rests her case. She didn't present any evidence, didn't call any witnesses, and she doesn't have to. The burden of proof is on the state.
Sure. And we know that if she were to be on the stand, of course, herself for sure, then that was also going to open up a lot of potential evidence or potential testimony about her own credibility, which is where we might have seen a lot more about her previous convictions come into the court in this trial. And so she knew in some ways, she would really be opening up a huge door. And of course, the judge has warned her about that several times throughout this trial. Be careful what you introduce, because the prosecution has the opportunity to refute that or to offer their own, sort of answer to that. And so I think that had to have played into some of that decision, knowing that that's a huge risk, of course, on her part.
Yeah.
But not having any testimony. So they moved into closing arguments today. Was it packed today? Were there lots of people there to see those closing statements?
Yes, of course it was packed. We were expecting this. And you mentioned her past convictions, Andrea, and I just want to lay out for folks that you're referring to her Idaho convictions, where she's convicted of killing her children, Tylee and JJ, and conspiring to kill her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. So that's the history here. The jury in this present case does not know that, but so many people in the courtroom do, including a lot of people in the gallery. That's why this case draws so much attention. And we also saw some of the, victims and tangential victims that we've seen over the years up in Idaho, and, just showing up for the, trial after trial to really see justice come forward in all of these different charges here. And yeah, people started lining up before 5 a.m. this morning, local time here in Arizona. I got there soon after 5, got a spot in line, and was able to get inside the courtroom as we want to be so we can see everything unfold. And some familiar faces that we saw in the crowd today included Kay Woodcock, JJ Vallow's grandma, and Charles Vallow's sister. We saw some of the Idaho investigators, not Ray Hermosillo. I know we've talked about him before. He's a Rexburg officer, but some of the investigators from Idaho. We saw Brandon Boudreau, who is actually the alleged victim of Lori Vallow Daybell's second conspiracy to commit murder case here in Arizona. And it looked like some more members of Charles Vallow's family. I saw an uncle of Lori Vallow Daybell. So people who have really been following this and who have had to show up to really just see the outcomes of these cases. And today, we'll get right to it. We don't know the outcome yet, because we'll get to, the closing arguments in just a minute. But the jury got the case late this afternoon here, local time in Arizona, and soon after that told the judge, we want to go home for the night. So they're, going to be sleeping on this and starting deliberations back up again tomorrow. But this, again, all coming after those closing arguments.
Yeah, and those arguments were long. I mean, it was a long afternoon, and it felt long simply because I think the way that the prosecution, certainly was meticulous in the way that she laid things out and very detailed. In fact, we'll get to some of this testimony or some of her closing statement, but even playing parts of testimony, replaying some of the things that we heard witnesses say during her closing statement, pulling those audio clips up or the video clips of the testimony, which was an interesting approach, playing some of that audio. But it seemed to me like it felt, it was absolutely comprehensive. I mean, if you missed any of the trial, I feel like you probably got everything you would need to know in that closing argument. How about just in the room? How did people do with that? Did it feel like it dragged? Did people seem to be very interested in it? How did the jury respond?
I think there were a lot of things, and I agree with your point that the prosecutor, Trina Kay, was very, very meticulous. And it felt like, as you said, a good recap of everything we've seen so far. But it felt like she also was almost bringing up every single piece of evidence, every single point she made over the 7 days where she introduced testimony and brought in witnesses, brought in evidence. So we were able to hear from her again, some of those text messages. We were able to hear some of those audio recordings that Lori Vallow Daybell made to the life insurance agent. She talked about the motives, money, Chad Daybell, the dark religious beliefs. So it was really a big recap of everything. However, I will say that she talked for more than 90 minutes. It was close to about an hour and 45 minutes. And the only reason I think she wrapped it up when she did was because the judge interjected at one point and said, "Will you be done soon? Because my court reporter needs a break. And, will you be done in 5 minutes?" And she's like, "I will be." I think it took a little longer than 5 minutes after that. But, just watching the jury, because it did feel, and it's a tough thing because it's not the prosecutor's job to put on a dazzling show. Even if people are sitting there and some of it might seem dry, some of it might seem meticulous. This is evidence in a conspiracy to commit murder case. And it's all very, very important. And yes, it did take a long time. I was actually texting. We have a legal expert here at 12 News, an attorney named Hector Diaz. And I was texting him. I'm like, what's the norm for closing arguments on each side? And he told me, 20 to 60 minutes is pretty routine. And then if you have a lot of evidence in a case, 90 minutes. But we, again, kind of went way past that with the prosecutor here. And I know people in the courtroom were getting restless. I could tell the jurors were getting fidgety, although they were looking straight ahead and listening. It wasn't like they were, tapping their watch saying, "Let's pick it up here." And nor would that be appropriate behavior. But yeah, it did feel like it was really long. And I've definitely seen closing arguments be delivered in a different way, in a more concise way. But I do think Trina Kay, again, the prosecutor, really just wanted to underscore everything here, maybe anticipating what Lori Vallow Daybell may say when it was her turn to give her closing arguments. Yeah.
And so we'll get to what the prosecutors say, but just to show you kind of that juxtaposition. So prosecutors, as we said, detailing everything and really, like you said, piece by piece evidence, each piece of evidence, each witness. I mean, she really did reference almost everyone that took the stand. Lori Vallow Daybell's, her strategy completely the opposite. I mean, I think when she got up to give her closing statement, her strategy was to tell the jury what they didn't see. And in doing so, got herself in a little bit of trouble along the way. A couple of moments that the prosecutors said, she's trying to introduce testimony here, simply not falling in the lines of the closing statement, but instead offering her opinion or offering information. And so, was there a reaction to that? Did that feel like so many times that she had to be stopped and told to redirect or told to keep going?
Yeah, and I know we'll play that clip in just a little while, but yeah, it definitely snagged, I would say, her presentation. I think I counted maybe 4 objections overall, which I know we said this happened one time during this, opening statements where she was objected to and the judge sustained it. And you said it was really rare, Andrea, that this happens. And I would imagine the same is true in closing arguments. But I think that's what you get when you have someone who is representing themselves, who decided to forego, legal counsel to represent them in this case. But I will say too that you talk about juxtaposition. We had the prosecutor kind of go on and on and on, really, again, highlighting every inch, it felt like, of this case. But Lori Vallow Daybell did kind of deliver her own take on everything. And I will say it was very different than what the prosecutor laid out, but she was really concise. And I think she was trying to be pretty punchy. So take a listen.
Why does the state want to blame someone for this tragic event? What evidence did the state show you in this trial that I wanted harm to come to my husband? We learned in this trial that I was praying for my husband. We learned in this trial that even though my husband and I were having marital issues, that we were both trying to do the best things for our son with special needs, JJ. We learned in this trial that I was shocked that Charles had changed his life insurance policy, but I was not angry as the state alleges. In the phone call we heard from the insurance company, we heard that I was disappointed for our children, our grown children, as well as our children still at home, but I was not angry. My husband Charles was providing for our children still at home. I had no motive to change that.
Even that, to me, it starts to skew a little bit more toward that testimony. Her own her own position on that or her own view, her own perspective, but we didn't see any objections there in that piece. But that wasn't, like we said, there were several of those as the prosecutor was paying very close attention. And it is very rare to hear that, like you said, likely because of the pro se, just doesn't have the legal defense or legal, expertise and the legal experience and education there. But I've seen a lot of people talking, and I can't disagree that it actually hasn't been as bad as what you might have expected. She has held her own in a lot of ways, barring anything that you feel about the evidence, but just in terms of her delivery in court, her ability to ask the questions and to kind of follow the procedure, follow the process. She's done that pretty well. And so, when you get into the closing statements, seeing her, kind of try to get her own opinion out there, I think is her own kind of personality. And we've seen her when she has something to say and she wants, she's frustrated by what's being said about her. That's when you see her get pretty pointed, pretty direct. And so it doesn't surprise me that she took today as the opportunity, said, we've talked about this before. She says it. The judge says, please don't, jury, you can't consider this, that this isn't part, you need to strike that, don't consider it. And yet you can't unhear it. And so if that is her way of kind of getting that doubt or, potentially entering some of the doubt in the jury's mind, maybe in that way she was successful. But I thought her closing statement was as much about what police didn't do and potentially the mishandling or the way that they handled the case. I think that was what her closing statement focused on more than anything.
Yeah, and we saw this while she cross-examined a lot of the investigators on this case, is that she was really trying to say, well, you didn't do this step, that maybe you don't think was necessary, but why wouldn't you do everything? So we heard this line of thought before, and I do agree that I think that's what she was trying to convey. But what also stood out to me, and I know we'll go back to some of those objections in just a moment, Andrea, because I do want to play that at some point, but, what strikes me about what she said there is how it was a totally different interpretation as what the prosecutor laid out. She's saying, well, why would I want to do any of this? Charles was a good man. We were trying to do what was best for our son. It's just the polar opposite of what we hear from the prosecutor. And where I think the prosecutor shined even more than laying out her initial closing arguments was when she had the chance to rebut Lori Vallow Daybell. So again, this is the prosecutor's burden of proof on this case. So they essentially have the opportunity to lay out their case. Then Lori Vallow goes, and then they have a chance to kind of have the final word here. And that's exactly what we saw from prosecutor Trina Kay. And we'll play this in just a moment. But there was really this moment where Lori Vallow Daybell, she wrapped up what she was saying, and prosecutor Trina Kay almost flew out of her chair. At least that's what it looked like. And she basically ran up there and was so are you kidding me? That's really what it felt like in the courtroom. And I think she was so much more powerful in those remarks when she had the second opportunity to kind of attack what Lori Vallow Daybell had said. And we want you to take a listen. Hear for yourselves.
The execution of Charles Vallow is not a family tragedy. There is nothing that you can say about shooting a man as he lay on the ground that you can try to construe in any way to make that a family tragedy. This case is about the defendant, not Alex Cox. Alex is involved in it because that is her co-conspirator. We are not here to determine his guilt, albeit it is quite obvious. This defendant wants you to just look at one piece, and she wants you to hope that there's only a person who will say, I heard the conspiracy. But what did you hear in every instruction is that you can look to other evidence to show that. This defendant wants you to forget about her words and pretend that when she told her lover, her soon-to-be husband, we got rid of him, that he changed the life insurance before we got rid of him, that somehow means what? That they killed him.
So that was the most dramatic and most powerful, part of her closing statement. And when she almost, as you said, almost ran to the microphone, eager to make that final statement, it was directly after Lori Daybell delivered that line that we have heard time and time again, that it was not a crime, that it was a family tragedy. This is something she has repeated in interviews. She has said, we've heard this time and time again. She said it in her opening statement, and essentially saying that the prosecution has construed, almost retrofitted, I think is the word she used, taken this and then retrofitted to make it a crime against her. And I think, Trina K, very eager to get up there and say, that's absurd. And I think that was exactly what her demeanor said, that's absurd. And I think she also did a very good job of explaining that even if you believe just one piece of this, so that even if you believe initially there was a scuffle, if you believe the story about the bat, if you believe the story about the fight with Tylee, even still, that second shot that was delivered with Charles Vallow laying on the ground, that alone could and would, likely, if you believe that happened, then that would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this was not self-defense. So, she broke her statement, her closing statement into three parts. She said, we're going to talk about what we showed you. We're going to talk about that evidence. We're going to talk about your instructions. But then she was very careful to kind of negate spent quite a bit of time negating any of those claims or those exceptions, if you will, that would have allowed this to be a justified killing. And so I think that was what, she did a very good job, I think, of explaining exactly what they would need to believe in order to have a conviction.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you mentioned Tylee, and it felt like Lori Vallow Daybell, as you said, Andrea, was trying to say, well, you didn't hear from these people, and we'll get to her, some of these objection moments in a moment. But it was hard to hear because, again, the jury does not know that in Idaho she is convicted of killing her children. And she talks about Tylee and her brother, Alex Cox, saying that we all cooperated. We all did this. Why would they think this is anything else but self-defense? And it's interesting because we did not hear interviews from Tylee or Alex Cox, nor can we hear them testify because Alex Cox is also dead. He died in December 2019, apparently of natural causes. And I think it's hard to have those missing pieces of the puzzle. And that does just leave Lori left to kind of have to explain herself. And I do think she tries. But again, the big question is, does this land with the jury?
Sure. Well, and I think it also, a lot of people have, because we do have so much information and we have so much of the video, we have seen the video of Charles Vallow talking to police. And there have been lots of people asking, why has that not been played? Why has that not been
myself included?
Exactly. We've talked about that, right? And so I looked in, did some research and was reading up on the laws and making sure that I understood why that is. And it's a hearsay law. It's essentially, we know that if something is, a person is put on the stand, then that evidence has the right to be, essentially the right to be cross-examined. And so because Charles is no longer living, we would only have this one context. And so there's nothing Lori would not have the opportunity to challenge that or to ask questions about it. And so that's why a lot of this evidence that we know exists simply wasn't brought into trial because of that rule. And there are some exceptions to it. But in this case, obviously, those were not allowed to be entered into evidence. And I think that's tough. We know that the jury has not seen those, but it's tough for us to know they exist and to feel like they are such a big piece that might be, far more telling for the jury, might be very helpful in their decision, and it just simply isn't legally allowed.
No, and I think that's, in a way, a hard pill to swallow because we have seen come up in other places. I want to say that maybe, correct me if I'm wrong or if you recall differently, but I want to say maybe some of that made its way into the Idaho case, or at least that I know it was a big point of reporting when we got our hands on that video. And I'll walk people back just so they know what we're talking about. This would have been in January 2019, at the end of January. And this is a key date for the prosecution, by the way. They laid this out and they talked about this was really when Lori and Charles's marriage started to unravel. And she went away to Hawaii, or we know now is Hawaii, and didn't talk to him for days. But this all stemmed from an incident where it was caught on body camera, where Charles Vallow calls Gilbert Police to say, I believe that Lori may have taken his truck, or there was something with the airport. He was out of town and coming back and his truck was gone. And he called and he tells them that he's worried for her. He's worried about the children. She thinks that he's taken over by some spirit named Ned, which is evidence that we heard in this case too. And he essentially is telling them she needs help. I want to help her. And it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking to see that. And yeah, it is hard to balance that. It almost feels like a horrible premonition for him. And it's hard that the jury doesn't know that, but I get why. It's a legal reason. And I think the prosecution has been very, very, very careful to stay on the right side of things where they don't cross into that territory that could get them in trouble.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. And I think it's very difficult for us. It's difficult to know all that we know and to realize that what has to be limited for that jury. And that actually kind of makes me think too about, it's interesting to me, and I'm curious how her strategy plays out, because it's her offering all of these things that didn't happen. She talks about no luminol on the gun, no luminol on the bat. We didn't look for blood. They didn't do this. They didn't do this test. There's the absence of this report that she thinks should be there with the walkthrough in the house. And yet, if they had done that, that doesn't mean that the results would have helped her. So there's no way of knowing, right? Exactly. It's just, that's all that it is. It's this little bit of doubt. And at the same time, after all of that, that we have seen, I have a hard time believing that this verdict won't come back relatively quickly. It seems so straightforward. It seems in a lot of ways, in all the cases that we've watched, it is a very simple case. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that they were able to present it in just 7 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, Andrea, it's because we aren't seeing the full scope of things that they were able to bring this case, forward in a way that they have so quickly, so cleanly, so narrowly. And I'll want to follow up. I want to go back to 2019 for a moment, because after Charles Vallow talked to police, again, we're referring to this video that we thought may come up, but ultimately was not introduced for, various reasons, maybe hearsay, and just, it complicates things. It really does. But we also remember that, we reported after the fact that Lori Vallow talked to police after that day too.
Right.
He wanted her to have a mental health exam. And we understand that happened, but we also have the body camera footage of when she talked to police, and she kind of talked her way out of it. It felt like, again, we've talked to, Gilbert Police about this. They said they did everything right in the, at that time. They couldn't have predicted what would happen here, but we hear from her in her words. And I think it shows some of the same characteristics where we've seen her in front of the jury, in front of the judge, where she's kind of talking her way and saying, like, well, he's crazy. There's nothing, we were in, we're not in a good spot. I think he's doing this to me. He might be doing that. And she kind of blames Charles for maybe the issues that they were going in, for him, expressing concern. And ultimately she, leaves the police station. And eventually, there's a few things transpired, but that was essentially the crux of what happened. And just that demeanor, again, I think is so important for the jury to see. And at one point during her closing arguments, she said, watch some of these interviews with me. There's one in particular that was admitted into evidence where she's talking with a detective after Charles' shooting. And she says, watch it all. Determine for yourself what my demeanor is. And, but we also saw, Andrea, that, she hit some roadblocks when she was trying to give her closing argument. So take a listen to that.
And yet, we were told by Detective Duncan, the case agent on this case on the stand, that because of some problem, the walkthrough is not recorded. Detective Duncan also informed us that he does not know if any of the people present wrote a report about it. We can infer from Detective Duncan's testimony and the fact that we don't have in evidence any body cam footage of the walkthrough and no reports talking about it, that there are none, even though this would be crucial evidence for you, the jury, to have.
Sustained. The jury should disregard that comment. Again, the jury can only consider evidence that was admitted into testimony. I'm sorry, testimony that was admitted into evidence or exhibits that were admitted into evidence.
The state of Arizona has the obligation to show you evidence to prove that this event was not self-defense, as stated by the only 3 witnesses. So why not show the jury all the evidence that they gathered?
Again, sustained. The jury can only consider the evidence and testimony that was admitted into evidence.
We learned in this trial that Alex fully cooperated with law enforcement. We learned that my daughter Tylee fully cooperated with law enforcement. We learned that I fully cooperated with law enforcement. We learned that law enforcement treated all of us that day kindly and courteously on July 11th, 2019. That law enforcement treated us that day like this was self-defense.
She pointed to that a couple of times. I think she, mentioned a press release that went out. Essentially, trying to paint the picture that police viewed it as self-defense, police viewed us as witnesses or victims. They didn't treat us as suspects, and so you shouldn't either. And I just don't know how well that plays.
No, and she tried to bring in that press release, and the judge, it was objected to because that was not introduced at all. She tried to bring it up during her cross-examination at one point, and it was shot down because that's not part of the evidence that was presented in this case. And yeah, it's interesting again how she tries to convey this doubt because the jury did not hear from her brother, Alex, or her daughter, Tylee. And we, of course, know why, because they are dead. And the jury does not know that. And I find it hard-pressed to, see if the jury, I would imagine, and we've talked about this before, Andrea, that the jury must know there is more to this story. They just have to, because they've mentioned all these people so tangentially and so casually, and we aren't hearing, they must know that there's more to this. And it'll be really interesting to see, and hopefully we hear from some of them after the fact. But again, they're just deliberating with what's in front of them now. And I'm wondering what you think, how Lori Vallow Daybell did overall, given these objections. And I think it's interesting because we didn't hear her really kind of harumph about it after the fact. She got the objection, it was sustained, and she moved on. And I thought she maintained composure in a way that we didn't always see throughout the rest of the trial.
Right. Which actually goes kind of back to what I was saying. I think that was a strategy. I have to believe that was intentional. I have to believe that she knew that her defense counsel that was helping her advisors, probably, I would think, may have told her that this is going to be, they're not going to let this go. They're going to object to this. And yet recognizing that it's worth the risk, because said she perhaps is now entering some information into their minds that would cause them perhaps to have a little bit of doubt. So I believe that could have been strategic. And if so, in that way, pretty smart. It's an interesting play. So what else do you think about in terms of was there any moment where people kind of saw her or saw that testimony or saw her or heard her closing statement that you felt like they were surprised by what she said or taken back? Was there any reaction to her closing statement at all from the gallery?
Oh, yes, of course. And, media is sitting in the back. I've explained, the setup a little bit before, but the jurors are over to my right. We have, the public and family sitting in front of us. And then it's Lori Vallow Daybell up to my left with her team. And then the prosecution on the other side with the judge directly in front of us. So yeah, we can hear a lot and see a lot of what's happening. And I know during her closing statements, and it was interesting because she kind of came in, she was definitely faster than the prosecution when laid out their case. So I think there was that initial, attention gripping. And you could tell that was the case for the jury, who was kind of listening intently after seeing them fidget a little at the end of the prosecution's first, closing statements. That, again, she was very meticulous in laying everything out. But yeah, there were some there were some expressions from the gallery. And of course, if that gets too busy or too loud, I'm sure the judge would have put a stopped that. But you hear subtle things. And I'll point out, too, that someone who wasn't there this morning but who came this afternoon was Colby Ryan, Lori Vallow Daybell's oldest son. And, I think everyone was maybe expecting that we could have gotten a verdict. It seems like a lot of the key people who we know have spoken to the media before, who have addressed us and who have spoken out and hopefully will again at the conclusion of this case, were there, they were ready, and they were waiting on this to happen. But again, these closing arguments just kind of went on and on and on. But as for a big moment, I think to me, it was when the judge stopped her, because you lose momentum when you do that. And that also doesn't put you in a good light when you have to be told over and over again, no, you cannot say this. That's not evidence that was introduced. You're testifying.
Sure.
It just shows to her lack of experience. And much like Lori Vallow Daybell is trying to bring up these things that the jury can't unhear, they also can't unsee how she's conducting herself and how she's, hitting these roadblocks. And it appears to be that it's because of her lack of experience. I don't think she's intentionally trying to get objected to,
Right. Sure. I think, and if she were, again, she might know that you're going to take the chance. I think you're going to hope that certain things slide. And we've seen the prosecutor allow some things that we know probably could have been objected to, that she kind of, I think, picked her battles and picked those moments that were most difficult. I think, that's when she was very quick to object. And if I can't think of most of the time the judge sustained those objections throughout the trial. Yeah. And so, I think that, people are used to that. The jury's certainly used to that. And I think she did everything she could to raise that doubt. And like I said, I will be very interested to see, we talk about those circumstances surrounding her previous convictions. I would expect that if there is a conviction here, we do know, we learned today that the prosecution will plan to introduce aggravating circumstances, which will then go in as they go into a sentencing phase. This is if Lori Vallow Daybell is convicted of the conspiracy to commit murder charge. And so that is where we would likely see some of this other information come into play. And that will be very interesting to watch the jury reaction there, because as we've said, this will be putting together some of those pieces that they likely are very curious about. At least they will have a little bit more insight, and it will be interesting to see how that changes their demeanor throughout any of this.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, the jury isn't going to learn this information until after they've deliberated. So they won't get to include that in deliberations, nor should it be. That's the proper channel for this case here. But I would love to pick their brains about what they think about this case now versus what they think about maybe when they hear some of this coming up in sentencing, once they start Googling her after, when they're allowed to. And, I want to say to Andrea that the last thing that they heard before they went into deliberations was the prosecutor on rebuttal. And again, we saw a difference in her delivery during this rebuttal compared to when she first started with her closing statements. And I think she really tried to go out with a bang, or maybe, again, this is my observation here, that, she's bitten her tongue a lot. You said she hasn't always objected to things. She's had to kind of sit through this and listen to Lori Vallow Daybell, sometimes tensely cross-examine her witnesses. And I wonder if she was just at this point where she's like, no, you are not going to buy anything that she says. And I think her last words to the jury before the case ultimately went to them were super powerful. So take a listen.
As many times as she wants to say Charles was my husband, she didn't want him as her husband. She wanted Chad Daybell. She wanted that life insurance policy, and yes, she was angry about it. And she said, we got rid of him. That is her confession to you. That is why she is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Thank you.
Right, yeah, you were right. She was very clear, very direct, made it very clear what she's asking of the jury, putting the responsibility now on them, but laying out that, Lori cannot be believed. She pointed out multiple times, multiple things that we have talked about, even on this show, about the things that she, was has lied about or was proven to be not true. Everything from information, credibility in terms of the Social Security, benefits, and how she wasn't honest with Social Security, not once, I believe, but twice. The time that she was away, I think even in the closing statement, the way that all of that, the relationship with Charles played out, I think also weakened Lori's arguments in her own closing statement about we were doing fine, or we had trouble, sure, but I didn't want to harm him. I wasn't trying to go. I think I will give Trina K a lot of credit for that in terms of, I think she, really did lay out everything so explicitly that it took a lot of steam away from any of Lori's, small, I guess moments of doubt. Somebody you were, watching along here with us was just asking about, one of the comments was asking about the, evidence in terms of that we talk about her past convictions. And what if we found out a juror now, if we found out at this point, what would happen if perhaps a juror brought that into their deliberation? Maybe, they had looked at that before. So what we do know is that there are two alternates, right? They seat multiple jurors, extras, if you will. And these jurors go through the entire trial. And everyone sits and listens to all of the same information. At the very end, they drew numbers. In fact, the judge joked about our high-tech way of doing it. His clerk takes and pulls a number out of a little bucket, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And so two people, those two jurors, they don't know who they're going to be. At that moment, I believe it was juror number 14 and juror number 5, are removed from deliberation. Right? They're essentially, and we know one of the jurors in one of her previous trials he was also an alternate. And so we've talked to him and heard from him about what that's like. And that's a whole experience to sit through a trial and then, only to find out that you don't get to deliberate. Right? Exactly. Yeah. So at this point, those two alternates, though, are still bound by all the rules. So if something happened now that would taint that jury, they would essentially remove a juror and then pull one of the alternates in. And the judge made that clear that he could do that.
Yes, he can. And I will point out, too, that, Andrea, this scenario should not be happening. I sat in on jury selection, and basically you had to disclose before you even got to this point if you knew anything about this case. And as we've heard all of this evidence, even if there was any sense, we had early on in testimony, one of the jurors say, after seeing a snippet of body cam, perhaps he was like, he let the court know, I think I may have seen this on YouTube before. And they said, okay, will this cloud your judgment? He said, no. And I think that transparency, this jury seems like they've been really open, honest, and transparent. Although it might seem wild to us to think that there are people out there who have no idea that there's a whole backstory to this, but should not have gotten to this point. If someone did know about her history, they would have needed to disclose that to the court, or else that's going to be a huge problem. And as you said, Andrea, there are alternates to choose from in case there is an issue with a juror. And there were 16 that were originally sat for this case. 2 were dismissed. We know one had a work issue, which again should have come up sooner, but it didn't. And they felt comfortable letting him go. We don't know what happened with another juror. She was, we were told one morning that she was just no longer part of the jury. So we don't know what happened. And my calculation, based on sitting in the courtroom, is that the 2 alternates that were selected today were men. So we know the makeup of the jury appeared to be 12 men and 2 women at this point, and ultimately 12 are deliberating. And it appears that we have, again, appearing, based on what we're seeing, the court cannot confirm or give us any information about these jurors, but it appears that the jury that is currently going to be deliberating this case would be 10 men and 2 women.
Interesting. Okay. And so they will begin again deliberation tomorrow. So they've decided they're going to they went into deliberation and then almost immediately said they were going to take the night off or leave for the night, go sleep, and then so officially beginning deliberations tomorrow morning. And at that point, then we're on verdict watch. We can't know how long this might take. Now we know, of course, we were there for these much more complicated, multiple charges, multiple, areas in each charge that the jury had to consider in her previous cases. So, I think we kind of sort of play that out and think, okay, this one far more far more simple, or simpler, this one for sure. So I would expect the jury to come back quicker. I'd be surprised if we don't have a verdict tomorrow. What do you think?
I think the same thing. I thought we knew they got it this afternoon. We knew they were getting it today. Mm-hmm. And I know we were chatting about this too on the side, thinking, okay, they're either going to finish it tonight, they're going to stay later and do it, or maybe they'll sleep on it and come back and do it tomorrow. And we don't know. It seemed, as you said, Andrea, that they got the case and pretty soon after said, we're going to go home. Mm-hmm. So we don't know if they actually got into this. I don't know if they took a quick vote already to be like, here's where we're starting. We don't know what they've discussed so far, but it seems like the bulk of their deliberation is going to be taking place tomorrow and beyond. So it'll be really interesting to see, because this jury was, again, there wasn't a lot of moments of emotion, I would say, seeing them, but it looked like they were really engaged. And we saw throughout the course of this trial that they were asking questions. They were, curious about certain points of evidence. Not all the questions could be asked in court, but I would imagine that this jury is going to be very thoughtful as they're deliberating. And we may see them issue some questions again to the judge if he's able to answer. Right. And I would imagine that they're going to spend some time. I don't think it'll be too quick, but I think they are going to go over everything, because there is a lot to digest and take in, and they don't want to make a snap decision here.
Sure.
Especially because they don't know that she has 3 life sentences in Idaho. They don't know that whatever the outcome is here, she's going to back to prison in Idaho, regardless, after all of these cases, all the proceedings are done in Arizona. So they should be treating this with, okay, this person's life is in our hands now, and we need to deliberate very seriously on that. So it'll be really interesting to see. But I do agree with you that I don't think they'll be taking too long. I think we'll have it by tomorrow afternoon.
I would agree. And even today, in the closing statement, Lori Vallow Daybell herself saying, please go watch the whole interview. I would be surprised if the jury didn't do that, just to be sure, right? And I think Trina Kay, the prosecutor, said, that's why we gave it to you. Absolutely. You can go watch that, go watch that interview. Us not presenting the entire thing, I think, she made that clear, us not giving you we've given that all to you. And so you have that at your disposal. You absolutely can watch that, and encourage you to do that. So I think, even that, just going through the evidence, I think a lot of jurors do that. You hear that from juries a lot, where they just want to be absolutely sure. So that in and of itself will take some time. But I would guess, like you said, I would think that by afternoon or evening, we would have a verdict tomorrow. And then we'll move into the next step, which will either be that she returns to Idaho if she is found not guilty of this charge, or we move right into the sentencing phase and that aggravating factor. So we will have lots to talk about, of course, depending on that verdict. And that's what you're going to be, right? You're going to be on verdict watch tomorrow. Do you have a sense that people will be kind of hanging out at the courthouse, all of these folks who've been there to watch? Do you think they'll stay and wait for that verdict?
Oh, 10,000%. Yes. People will definitely be there. The reporters who have been coming in and out, covering this day in, day out, we were like, how early do we think we need to arrive tomorrow? And, there are reserved seats for some media. It's not, unlimited seating, but yeah, people from media and the public, as I mentioned right at the beginning, showed up before 5 a.m. today. So I think we will see more of the same tomorrow, because people are interested to see where this goes. And I think, like us, I think a lot of people are suspecting that it may not take more than one full day here to get an answer. And I think people want to see that moment where a verdict is read. They want to see Lori Vallow Daybell's reaction to the verdict being read. And no matter the outcome of what we're going to see tomorrow or beyond, if it takes the jury longer than that to reach a verdict, we know that this is only her first conspiracy to commit murder case here in Arizona. We are expecting a second one for her. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering if a verdict in this case, for example, say she's found guilty, if that may sway how she proceeds with her next case. Or if she's found not guilty, will she say, well, hey, I did a darn good job representing myself. Let me, keep going.
Let's do it again.
I think it's really,
Yeah,
I think there's some unknowns there. And I would imagine, and I don't know this for sure, and, I would imagine that maybe the sentencing we will wait to see that. So she's sentenced for both cases together. I'm not sure, but that would be something I could possibly expect to see, just because that would be, that would really round out a conclusion here in this case. But we don't want to put the cart before the horse. We're not there yet. We're still waiting on a verdict in this case so far.
Right. And of course, like I said, Erica Stapleton will be in the courtroom. I will be here. We will bring you that verdict as soon as it happens whenever it happens. We will be on Verdict Watch, and we hope that you will be here with us for that inside the courtroom. We will see you then.